My name is Sydney Vale. I am 32 years old, and I run a risk mitigation and industrial resilience company that my family called a hobby for 9 years. 3 weeks ago, I stood in a packed federal bankruptcy court in Hartford, while my father and my brother tried to publicly destroy me to cover a $2.4 million theft. There were 60 people in that courthouse and the lobby outside. Executives I had worked with, attorneys who knew my reputation, local business leaders who were there to watch what they thought would be my professional execution. My father sat with his hands folded, playing the wounded patriarch. My brother Bryce wore a navy Brooks Brothers suit and grinned, like this was a fraternity prank he had already won. What they didn't know was that Bryce had already touched something 9 days earlier that he should never have been able to access. And the company they spent years mocking as my little hobby. It didn't just protect warehouses and supply chains. It helped safeguard pieces of federal infrastructure. Before I tell you what happened in that courtroom and how it all fell apart for them, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if this story resonates with you. Drop a comment telling me where you are watching from and what time it is there. Now, let me take you back to when I first understood that my family didn't just underestimate me. They needed me invisible. I was 11 the first time I won something my father couldn't control. It was a statewide math and design competition for middle schoolers. I had built a logistics model for municipal emergency routing that included real-time congestion variables and alternate pathing for ambulances. The judges gave me a silver plaque, mounted in a cherrywood frame. My father Harrison didn't come to the ceremony. He was at Bryce's prep school lacrosse game, 2 hours away. When I showed him the plaque that night, he looked at it for maybe 3 seconds. Then he looked at me. "Bryce knows how to lead people," he said. "You know how to alphabetize them." I kept that plaque in my bedroom closet for the next 17 years, not because I was ashamed of it, because I learned early that visibility in my family came with a cost. When I was 19, I spent the summer working at my father's company, Vale Industrial Systems. It was supposed to be an internship, something to put on a resume, but I am good with patterns. And I started noticing vendor discrepancies, duplicate invoices, wire references that appeared twice in different months, with slightly altered amounts. I flagged them for the CFO, a woman named Eleanor Mercer, who had worked for my father for 12 years. Eleanor looked at my findings. She didn't dismiss them, but she also didn't act on them. 2 days later, my father called me into his office. He didn't yell, he just closed the door and said, "Not every number is a conspiracy, Sydney." The CFO never mentioned my findings again. I learned something that summer that took me years to name. Questions weren't punished because they were wrong. They were punished because they were correct. I printed those wire references at 2:13 in the morning from the basement printer, before I left for college that fall. I didn't know why. I just knew I should. Eleanor found me in the parking lot the next morning. She handed me a folder. Inside were copies of those same wire references, but with additional annotations. She didn't say anything. She just squeezed my shoulder and walked back inside. By the time I was 28, I had been working at Vale Industrial for 6 years. I ran a division nobody else wanted: risk mitigation, resilience planning, operational continuity for facilities that couldn't afford downtime. My father had built it as a consulting add-on to keep clients happy. I turned it into something real. I brought in contracts with logistics hubs, secure storage operations, and entities that couldn't publicly explain why they needed what we provided. It became the only division in the company landing long-horizon work. At a holiday dinner that year, Bryce raised his wine glass and said I was selling armored Pinterest boards to paranoid municipalities. Everyone laughed, including my mother Lenora, including the executives my father had invited to impress. I didn't say anything. I just wrote 3 words on a yellow legal pad I kept in my purse. "Carve it out." That night, in the lobby bar of a Marriott near my apartment, I mapped the entire separation. I would take the resilience unit, rebrand it, and build it independently. It took 14 months. My family told everyone I couldn't handle real leadership. They were wrong. But letting them believe it bought me time. I formally launched Northbridge Shield Works when I was 29. Small team specialized contracts, quiet reputation. The kind of work that doesn't generate headlines, but generates trust. My family continued to dismiss it. Bryce called it my little side gig. My father never asked about revenue. That was the pattern I finally understood. They used my labor when it suited them. They mocked my visibility when it didn't. And they blamed me when risk surfaced. Leaving wasn't rebellion. It was self-preservation. Here's what you need to understand about what happened 3 weeks ago. It wasn't just a legal dispute. It was a calculated campaign to erase me because I had become the only person who could credibly expose what my father had done. For 18 months, Harrison Vale had been quietly extracting money from Vale Industrial. The amount eventually tied back to him was $2.4 million. When the SEC began circling, my family needed a narrative, and the narrative they built was this. Sydney's spin-off entity, Northbridge Shieldworks, had siphoned funds during the separation, that I had misallocated assets, that I had damaged vendor confidence and destabilized operations, that I was reckless, vengeful, and financially erratic. The involuntary bankruptcy petition they filed against me in federal court wasn't designed to recover money. It was designed to destroy my credibility before I could defend it. If they could freeze my leverage, wreck my financing, spook my clients, and publicly stain my reputation, then my version of events would never matter. The professional stakes were immediate. Northbridge depends on trust, operational continuity, strict compliance, and total discretion. Even rumors of insolvency could trigger contract reviews, delay payroll for my specialist staff, jeopardize access credentials, and cause cascading reputational damage across every entity I worked with. But the deeper stakes were something else entirely. I wasn't just losing money. I was being recast as unstable, greedy, and dangerous by the people who raised me. And if I stayed quiet, their lie would become the official record. The breaking point wasn't emotional. It was structural. It stopped being about saving the relationship the moment they weaponized a courtroom. I had the documents, carve-out agreements proving Northbridge's legal separation. Vendor records showing Vale Industrial's financial irregularities predated my departure. Board emails demonstrating that my father had overridden internal controls repeatedly. Banking trails showing extraction patterns across the exact 18-month window. The SEC was reviewing. I had all of it, but I also had something they didn't know about. And Bryce and his arrogance had just made it worse for both of them. 3 weeks ago, at 10:12 in the morning, I walked into the federal courthouse in Hartford with my husband Noah and our outside counsel. The hallway was packed. Attorneys, creditors, executives who had worked with Vale Industrial or heard rumors. People who were there because bankruptcy filings are public, and scandal travels fast in a small business community. I saw Bryce first. He was standing near the courtroom entrance in that navy suit, grinning. Not smiling. Grinning. Like this was a social event he was hosting. My mother Lenora stood a few feet away, gripping her handbag and avoiding my eyes. My father Harrison stood with his attorney, playing the role he had perfected over 40 years. The injured patriarch. The man forced into a sad but necessary action to protect the family business. I understood immediately. This wasn't legal necessity. It was theater. They were performing for the audience. The petition was filed publicly. My family's counsel stood and began outlining the case. They implied I had concealed assets, that I had destabilized financial obligations, that I had engaged in evasive transfers, and operated in bad faith during the company separation. The language was careful, just vague enough to sound damning without being disprovable in that moment. Bryce leaned over to someone near him and said, loud enough for half the room to hear, "She always did like drama if it bought her attention." I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I didn't lunge across the aisle. I just asked one question. My voice was calm when I spoke. I looked directly at their attorney and said, "Can counsel specify which obligations are mine, and which are simply convenient for you to assign to me?" The room shifted, not dramatically, but you could feel it. The first crack in the narrative. Bryce tried to recover. "You could have settled this privately if you weren't obsessed with proving something." I waited 2 seconds, then I said, "You filed in open court, Bryce." My father leaned forward. Families disagree. It should never have gotten this far. I looked at him. Number families argue at dinner. Families do not hire lawyers to bankrupt each other in front of the entire city. That was the moment I knew they had miscalculated. They thought public humiliation would silence me. What it did was create a record, and records don't bend. Years earlier, Eleanor Mercer, my father's former CFO, and the woman who had quietly become my ally, told me something I didn't fully understand at the time. We were sitting in her office after I had flagged those duplicate invoices. She said, "Never confuse family access with legal safety. Sydney, keep the first draft, the final draft, and the version they swear never existed." I didn't know why she said it, but I listened. And I started keeping everything. 3 years ago, when I began the carve-out, I documented every step, every email, every board resolution, every vendor agreement, every wire transfer. Not because I expected a lawsuit. Because Eleanor had taught me that truth is only truth if you can prove it. In the week before the bankruptcy hearing, I did something deliberate. I allowed a controlled internal memo to exist in a narrow channel within Northbridge. The memo referenced a possible facility transition in Milwaukee operational planning. Vendor assessments, timeline projections, preliminary only. The memo was false. There was no Milwaukee facility, but the memo was specific enough, detailed enough, and restricted enough that if someone accessed it, I would know. And I would know why. Bryce had always dismissed Northbridge as decorative. He thought it was small, niche, irrelevant, because he thought that. He became sloppy, because he assumed I was emotional rather than strategic. He thought I wouldn't see him coming. He was wrong on both counts. 9 days before the bankruptcy hearing, someone attempted to trace the Milwaukee facility transition through internal channels that only someone with improper access could reach. That someone was tied to Bryce's assistant. Bryce had touched something he had no legitimate reason to see, and in doing so, he created evidence of interference that went far beyond sibling rivalry. The night the petition was filed, Noah and I sat at our kitchen island surrounded by binders, flagged emails, and cold coffee. It was 11:47 at night. I made a decision. I would not retaliate socially or emotionally. I would answer the only way that mattered, with documentation. Our outside counsel Margaret Chen had already started building the response, but I needed to give her everything. The evidence came in 4 categories. First, the carve-out agreement. Signed by Harrison himself 3 years prior, notarized, filed with the state. It proved Northbridge's complete legal separation. Second, server access logs. 3 attempts to access operational planning files over 9 days. IP addresses traced to Vail Industrial's network, late-night timestamps, when most staff would be gone. Someone was hunting. Third, email chains from Bryce's assistant, asking vendors about Midwest facility capacity and Wisconsin compliance requirements. Questions that only made sense if someone had seen the Milwaukee memo. But the Milwaukee memo wasn't real. It was bait. Fourth, Eleanor's parallel ledger of Harrison's transactions. $2,427,650 in wire transfers, miscoded expenses, and phantom consulting fees over 18 months. Noah looked at the spread. This is enough. I shook my head. It is enough to defend, not enough to win. We need to show why they filed it. Eleanor arrived 40 minutes later. She set a folder on the island. Inside were board minutes from meetings I hadn't attended. Harrison raising concerns about Sydney's entity. Bryce suggesting Northbridge might be siphoning resources. The narrative had been building for months. They had been laying groundwork to make me the scapegoat long before the second query started. Eleanor said, "Don't prove everything at once. Let him volunteer the rest." I understood. Bryce's confidence was his liability. Noah asked, "Are you still trying to save them?" I said, I am trying to survive them." Margaret arrived at 1:15 in the morning. By 3 o'clock, we had the strategy. Comprehensive response, counterclaims, sanctions motion, and the access violations as the centerpiece. Because Bryce's interference wasn't just unethical, given Northbridge's work, it crossed lines most people would never know existed. Noah asked. What if they call this revenge? I said. Then they can explain why revenge required federal filings and access to restricted operational information, Eleanor said. He will try to minimize it. He always does, I said. I know. We filed 72 hours later. 4 days later, we were back in court. This time, the room was larger. More observers. Several local executives, who hadn't been at the first hearing, were now present. Word had spread. The courtroom had that specific energy that comes when people sense they are about to witness something that will be retold for years. My father arrived looking calm. Bryce arrived looking confident. Too confident. He nodded at someone in the gallery like he was at a country club mixer. That is when I knew Eleanor had been right. He had no idea how much trouble he was in. Our counsel stood first, Margaret Chen, 22 years of bankruptcy and commercial litigation experience. She spoke in the tone of someone who doesn't need to raise her voice to command attention. She dismantled the insolvency narrative piece by piece, showed Northbridge's independent capitalization from day one, showed payment stability across every quarter since formation, showed contract continuity with 12 separate entities, none of which had filed complaints or reported concerns, showed that every obligation the petition claimed I had failed to meet was either fabricated or belonged to Vail Industrial, not to me. She walked through the carve-out agreement, signed by Harrison himself, that clearly delineated which assets, which liabilities, and which operational domains belonged to Northbridge. The petition began to look less like a protective measure and more like a weapon. My father's attorney, a man named Gordon Tesh, who had worked with the Vail family for 30 years, tried to pivot. He stood and said the family had concerns about transparency and communication during the separation, that Sydney had been unresponsive to reasonable requests for information, that the family had a fiduciary obligation to understand where company resources had gone. Margaret let him finish. Then she said, Your Honor, we would like to address the question of who was seeking information from whom, and why. Our counsel moved to the second phase. Margaret presented a timeline. Interest in the Milwaukee facility originated from inquiry behavior linked to Bryce. She displayed emails, system access attempts, questions from his assistant Ashley to vendors about Midwest capacity and Wisconsin compliance. Bryce waved it off with that dismissive tone he had perfected. That is standard due diligence. I am allowed to understand my sister's company. Margaret waited 3 full seconds. Mr. Vail, the Milwaukee facility you are referencing was a non-operational preliminary draft with restricted circulation. Northbridge has 11 employees. 4 people had access. You were not one of them. The room went silent. You could hear the HVAC. Bryce's attorney started to object. Bryce interrupted. It was a facility memo. Who cares? That sentence destroyed him. Because it confirmed he had seen it, recognized it, and acted on it. Margaret didn't smile. Mr. Vail just confirmed unauthorized access to proprietary operational planning. Thank you for that clarification. Then Daniel Reeves stood. Daniel doesn't speak in open court often. Former Dodd, the kind of consultant who uses words like operational continuity and access integrity with weight, most people will never understand. He buttoned his suit jacket. Your Honor, the Milwaukee memo referenced continuity planning for entities with federal compliance obligations. Mr. Vail's access attempts triggered mandatory incident, reporting to 3 separate oversight bodies. Those reports were filed 6 days ago. The temperature in the room dropped. Interference with operational planning for federally contracted resilience work isn't a family dispute. It is a security incident. Judge Holtz's face changed completely. She leaned forward. Mr. Reeve, are you telling me this case involves potential violations of access protocols for federally regulated work? Daniel said. Yes, Your Honor. Northbridge's NDA obligations prevent me from elaborating, but Mr. Vail's admission just created an evidentiary record that 3 federal compliance officers are already reviewing. Bryce's face went white. Not pale white. His attorney grabbed his arm and whispered something urgent. My father's jaw was so tight I could see the muscle jumping. Paul Hendricks, the Vail industrial executive, stood up and walked out of the gallery. Just walked out mid-hearing. An attorney behind me closed her folder and stared at the table like she was trying to become invisible. The courtroom wasn't just reorienting, it was fracturing in real time. Judge Holtz asked Bryce directly, voice cold as January. Did you access restricted documents without authorization? Bryce tried to laugh. Your Honor, this is my sister's company. Family looks out for each other. Judge Holtz did not smile. Mr. Vale. That does not answer my question. Did you or did you not access restricted operational planning documents without authorization? His attorney finally cut in. Your Honor, my client declines to answer at this time. But Bryce's earlier line, who cares, was already in the record, already being transcribed, already creating the paper trail that 3 federal agencies were apparently reviewing. My father's face had gone from calm to rigid. His jaw was tight. He was looking at Bryce not as an ally anymore, but as a liability. One of the executives in the gallery, a man named Paul Hendricks, who had worked with Vale Industrial for 15 years, stood up and walked out. Just walked out mid-hearing without looking back. An attorney 2 rows behind me closed her folder, pushed it away from her like it was contaminated, and stared at the table. Someone in the front row whispered to the person next to them. The whisper carried, federal compliance officers? Another voice, louder. Did he really just admit that? The room wasn't just reorienting, it was fracturing. You could see people physically creating distance, moving seats, shifting eye contact. No one wanted to be associated with what they had just witnessed. The narrative my family had tried to build that I was reckless, vengeful, financially unstable, was collapsing in real time. What replaced it was something worse for them. A picture of coordinated misconduct, of financial extraction, of scapegoating, of predatory legal tactics designed not to recover funds, but to silence the one person who had documentation to expose the truth. And now, apparently, of security violations that had federal agencies involved. I didn't rant. I didn't raise my voice. I looked at Bryce and I said, "You spent years calling my work a hobby. Today is apparently the first day you have understood it had consequences." The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was full of realization, full of consequences forming in real time. Then Judge Holtz spoke. Her voice was controlled, but the words landed like stones. I have rarely seen a family so willing to devour its own child, to cover its own crimes. She denied the petition. She didn't just dismiss it. She denied it with language that made it clear she found the filing malicious, not protective. She used words like bad faith, abuse of process, and predatory conduct. Our counsel moved for sanctions and for protective measures to prevent further harassment. Judge Holtz granted both. The hearing was over. Northbridge initiated additional internal and external security containment. We changed access protocols, updated vendor communication channels, implemented new audit procedures for any external inquiry that came through informal channels. Daniel Reeve conducted a full security review to ensure that no other vulnerabilities existed. I sent formal instructions to our attorney, to our accountant, and to every entity that did business with both Northbridge and Vale Industrial. The instructions were clear. All communication regarding Northbridge operations would go through official channels only. No informal phone calls, no casual hallway conversations, at industry events, no family favors. The boundary was structural, not emotional. That made it enforceable. My father tried to approach me in the hallway after the hearing. I saw him moving toward me while I was talking to Margaret and Daniel. He had that look on his face. The look that said he wanted to explain, to clarify, to reframe what had just happened as a misunderstanding rather than what it actually was. I didn't stop walking. I didn't make eye contact. I just kept moving toward the exit. Noah was beside me. Margaret was on my other side. My father called my name once. Sydney. I didn't turn around. Margaret quietly said, "Keep walking," so I did. That night, my mother sent me a message. Not a call. A message, it said. "Please don't destroy what is left of the family. We can work through this if you just give us a chance to explain." I read it 3 times. Then I put my phone down and didn't respond. 2 days later, Bryce sent a text. I showed it to Noah. It said, "You really did all this over pride. You could have just asked if you wanted to know something." I stared at that message for a long time. The audacity of it. The complete failure to understand what he had done. Or maybe he understood perfectly and was trying to recast it as something smaller, something forgivable, something I was overreacting to. I didn't answer that either. But I did respond once to my father. 3 days after the hearing, he sent me an email. Subject line: moving forward. The email was careful, legalistic. It called the hearing a misunderstanding. It said the petition had been filed out of legitimate concern for the family business. It said things never needed to become public. It said we could resolve this privately if I would just agree to mediation. I read it twice. Then I wrote back. One sentence: "You did not lose your daughter in court. You lost access to the person you kept trying to sacrifice." I didn't hear from him again for 4 months. My mother tried twice more. Once through a voicemail, once through a card she sent to my home address. The card had a picture of a sunset on the front. Inside, she had written about family, about forgiveness, about how life was too short for grudges. She didn't mention the bankruptcy petition. She didn't mention sitting in that courtroom while they tried to destroy me. She didn't mention any of it, just talked about forgiveness, like it was something I owed rather than something they needed to earn. I didn't respond to that either. One of my cousins, someone I had barely spoken to in a decade, sent me a Facebook message. She said the family was worried about me, that I was isolating and letting bitterness take over. She said she understood I was hurt, but that family is family. I blocked her, not out of anger. Out of efficiency. I refused all private reconciliation attempts, pending formal accountability that never came. Not apologies. Accountability. An acknowledgement of what they had done, why they had done it, and what they intended to do differently. That acknowledgement never arrived. And after a while, I stopped waiting for it. In the 2 weeks after the hearing, the local business community turned hard against Harrison Vale. The petition, which was supposed to humiliate me, was now being discussed as predatory, not principled. Vendors who had worked with Vale Industrial for years began distancing themselves. I heard through Eleanor that one vendor, a logistics company that had been with Vale for over a decade, quietly ended their contract renewal negotiations. They didn't cite the bankruptcy petition specifically. They just said they were exploring other partnerships. Board contacts stopped returning calls as quickly. Emails that used to be answered within hours now took days, if they were answered at all. The SEC pressure intensified, because my family had now generated a public record of dysfunction, financial irregularities, and internal misconduct. There was now a court transcript, testimony under oath, evidence submitted into the public record. The kind of material that turns informal inquiry into formal investigation. Bryce was quietly removed from the board of a civic organization he had been on for 6 years. The Harbor District Development Council. They didn't make an announcement, they just stopped listing him on their website. When someone asked about it at a networking event, the executive director said something about organizational restructuring and changed the subject. 2 business development conversations he had been part of collapsed. One was a commercial real estate partnership. The other was a joint venture with a firm in Boston. Not because of formal accusations, because people stopped trusting his judgment. Because when you publicly humiliate a family member in federal court, and then get caught accessing restricted information you had no business seeing, people start asking what else you might do if it suited you. Vale Industrial Systems began facing consequences that financial extraction alone wouldn't have triggered. Their primary lender, a regional bank that had financed their operations for 18 years, initiated a full covenant review. Insurance carriers began asking questions about internal controls, document retention policies, and whether the company had adequate DFAO coverage given the emerging legal exposure. The board fractured. 3 independent directors resigned within 6 weeks. One cited philosophical differences, another cited time constraints. The third didn't cite anything. She just sent her resignation letter and stopped responding to outreach. Internal document preservation demands from outside counsel turned the company's operations into an archaeological dig. Every email, every wire transfer, every vendor agreement, every board resolution, everything had to be preserved, cataloged, and made available for review. My father could no longer sell the story that I had been the rogue operator. The scapegoat mechanism broke. And once it broke, the truth had room to spread. Extended family members began calling me quietly. Cousins I hadn't heard from in years. My mother's sister, Aunt Diane, who had always been careful to stay neutral in family conflicts. They weren't calling to apologize fully. They were calling to admit they had suspected something, that they had seen how my father treated me differently from Bryce, that they had wondered why I left Vale Industrial so abruptly, that they had heard things over the years that didn't quite add up. Some were sincere. I could hear it in their voices, the hesitation, the regret, the recognition that silence had been easier than intervention. Some were simply repositioning, trying to get on the right side of a story they could see was shifting. I noticed the difference. You can always tell when someone is apologizing for what they did, versus apologizing for how it looks now that you have won. My mother left me a voicemail 3 weeks after the hearing. She talked about holidays, about recipes she wanted to share, about memories from when I was young, about your father's pride, and how he was struggling with all of this. She didn't mention the bankruptcy petition. She didn't mention the courtroom. She didn't mention that she had sat there and watched while her husband and her son tried to destroy me publicly. She just talked about holidays. I didn't respond for 6 days. When I did, I sent a text. Not a call, a text. It said, "I am not discussing holidays with people who tried to erase me on the public record." She didn't respond. One cousin, Meredith, someone I hadn't spoken to in years, sent me a handwritten letter. Not an email. Not a text. A letter. She apologized for staying silent when I was younger. For not intervening when she saw how my father treated me differently. For believing the family narrative that I was difficult when I was really just being discarded. She didn't ask for anything. She just said she was sorry. She said she wished she had been braver. I accepted the apology, but I didn't offer access. Apology is not the same as trust. And trust, once broken this completely, doesn't rebuild on the same terms. 3 months after the hearing, Eleanor told me something I hadn't known. We were sitting in her office, the same office where she had squeezed my shoulder 24 years earlier. She said she had considered resigning from Vale Industrial years earlier, because of Harrison's conduct, not just the financial irregularities. The way he treated me, the way he dismissed my work, the way he weaponized Bryce's favor against me. She had stayed because she hoped I would eventually leave with enough documentation to survive. That revelation complicated the moral picture. Not everyone in my family's orbit had been innocent, but some had been trying, weakly and imperfectly, to limit the damage. Eleanor had been documenting things for years, not to use against Harrison, but to give to me if I ever needed it. Noah told me something around the same time. He said I needed to stop measuring every person only by whether they had saved me. Some people, he said, were just too cowardly. That didn't make them monsters, it made them complicit. But complicity and cruelty are not identical. I am still learning to separate those. It is harder than it sounds. 6 months after the hearing, I expanded Northbridge into a new secured operations facility. Real this time. Not Milwaukee. A 12,000 square foot climate-controlled space, in a low-profile industrial park 40 minutes outside Hartford. We brought on 3 additional staff members, specialists in continuity planning, systems resilience, and access control. Contracts that had been paused during the bankruptcy petition drama were reactivated. New contracts came in. Entities that had been watching from a distance to see how I would handle the pressure decided I had handled it well enough. We cleared a major operational continuity review, with scores that exceeded baseline expectations. The work I had spent 9 years building, the work my family had mocked as decorative, proved itself under the exact kind of scrutiny they had tried to weaponize against me. Bryce was no longer introduced at business events, with the easy certainty he used to carry. I heard about this from 3 separate people who didn't know they were telling me the same story. He would show up at a networking event or a fundraiser. Someone would introduce him. "This is Bryce Vale. He is with Vale Industrial Systems," and the room would get polite. Not cold. Just polite. The warmth was gone. But the real break came at a Harbor District Development Council dinner, 10 months after the hearing. Bryce had been quietly removed from the board, but he still attended public events. He was standing near the bar when Marcus Chen, Margaret's husband, a commercial developer, walked past him to shake hands with someone else. Bryce tried to join the conversation. Marcus looked at him, paused, and said loud enough for 6 people to hear, "I am sorry, do we have business together?" Bryce said. They had known each other for years. Marcus said, "I remember, but I don't do business with people who compromise federal security protocols over family grudges." Then Marcus turned his back and continued his conversation. Bryce stood there for maybe 15 seconds. Then he left. "I heard he didn't come back to another public event for 4 months. The automatic trust that comes with a family name in a small business community had evaporated." People smiled, shook his hand, moved on quickly. He was still there. He still had access. But the access didn't translate into opportunity anymore. And for someone like Bryce, who had spent his entire life coasting on proximity to power, that erasure was worse than exile. What broke him wasn't being attacked. It was being dismissed. The shift I experienced wasn't dramatic. It was internal. I started sleeping better. I delegated more. I stopped explaining my success in a tone designed to sound non-threatening. I stopped translating cruelty into misunderstanding. That was the deepest change. For years, I had been taught that if I could just explain myself more clearly, more calmly, more reasonably, my family would see me. They didn't. Not because I failed to explain, but because they needed me not to be seen. Tonight, I am standing in the secured corridor of Northbridge's new operations facility. It is after hours. The only sounds are the low hum of climate control and the soft electronic buzz of badge access panels. The corridor is lined with brushed steel panels and recessed LED strips, casting clean white light. Everything here is quiet, clean, functional. No drama, no performance. Just systems doing what they are designed to do. I used to think my family mocked this work because they didn't understand it. I was wrong. They mocked it because it didn't need them. And the life they dismissed as irrelevant became the life that saved me.